His teacher never noticed him, never called on him. To her, he was just another forgettable student, easy to overlook. But the day she tried to put him in his place, to expose him in front of everyone, he sat at the piano, and everything changed. The moment his fingers touched the keys, the room fell silent. And as the music filled the air, the look on her face said it all. She never saw it coming. Elijah Rivers sat in the third row by the window, where the golden afternoon sun poured onto his desk in thin streaks. It was his favorite seat, not because it had the best view, but because it allowed him to observe. Watching was something he had gotten good at. He had learned to watch how Miss Thornton treated her students, how her voice softened when Brandon, Madison, or Sarah spoke, how she encouraged them to elaborate on their answers, asking them follow-up questions, nodding thoughtfully as if their opinions mattered. But Elijah? She rarely called on him. It wasn't obvious, never cruel, never direct, but he noticed. When he raised his hand, she'd let her eyes skim right past him, as if he were just another face in the crowd. If he got an answer right, she'd move on so fast it was like he hadn't spoken at all. And when he got something wrong, which didn't happen often, she let the silence stretch, almost as if she wanted him to feel it. He didn't need to be the center of attention. He just wanted to be seen. It wasn't just him who noticed either. One afternoon, after Elijah had been ignored for the fourth time that day, his best friend Tyler leaned over, smirking. You could disappear, and she wouldn't care. Elijah let out a small chuckle. Guess so. But the truth? It stung more than he wanted to admit. At first, he had told himself it didn't matter. Not every teacher would like him. Some students were favorites. That was just how things were. But deep down, he knew that wasn't it. Miss Thornton didn't just ignore him. She dismissed him. And after months of watching her light up for some students while barely acknowledging others, Elijah had started to wonder why. Had she already made up her mind about him? Did she think he wasn't worth the time? That thought lodged itself deep in his chest. It made him grip his pencil tighter during lessons. It made him raise his hand even when he knew she wouldn't pick him, just to prove to himself that he was still trying. But something had changed. Lately, it wasn't just frustrating. It was starting to burn, and a part of him, a quiet, stubborn part that had never spoken up before, was starting to think that maybe he didn't want to just blend into the background anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he was tired of being invisible. And soon, Miss Thornton would have no choice but to see him. Elijah sat in his usual seat, tapping his pencil lightly against his desk as Miss Thornton's lesson droned on. The rhythm was familiar, predictable. She asked questions. The same students answered. The cycle repeated. Elijah didn't even bother raising his hand anymore. It wasn't that he didn't know the answers. He did. But after months of being ignored, what was the point? He had resigned himself to the fact that in Miss Thornton's classroom, he was invisible. That's why, when she suddenly called his name, he almost didn't react. Elijah. The single word sliced through the hum of the room. Heads turned. Conversations stilled. A few students exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to mild confusion. Elijah blinked, his grip tightening around his pencil. Had he imagined it? But Miss Thornton was looking directly at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. She was waiting. He sat up straighter, caught off guard but refusing to let it show. His mind quickly scanned through the discussion, piecing together the last thing she had asked. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale, he answered smoothly. The response was crisp, confident, textbook perfect. Normally, Miss Thornton would move on immediately, barely acknowledging him before shifting her attention elsewhere. But this time she didn't. Instead, she hesitated. She tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing together as if considering something. Not bad, she murmured. It was a simple remark, but something about it felt different. She wasn't just acknowledging his answer. She was studying him. The pause stretched a second too long, long enough for Elijah to notice, long enough for everyone to notice. Across the room, Tyler raised an eyebrow, silently asking, what was that about? Elijah wasn't sure. Miss Thornton didn't say anything else. After another brief moment, she moved on, directing the next question to someone else. But Elijah could feel it, the shift. For the rest of the class, he caught her watching him. Not constantly, not in an obvious way, but enough for him to feel the weight of her attention. It wasn't the same dismissive glance she usually gave him. This was different. This was deliberate. And for the first time, Elijah found himself wondering what had changed. The final bell rang, signaling the end of class. Chairs scraped against the floor as students hurried to gather their books and bags, eager to leave. Elijah moved at his usual pace, calm, steady. He had learned that in a world where people overlooked him, there was no point in rushing. But just as he slung his bag over his shoulder and turned toward the door, Miss Thornton's voice stopped him. "Elijah, stay behind for a moment." A few students slowed. Their curiosity piqued. Miss Thornton never asked Elijah to stay behind. Tyler shot him a questioning glance, but Elijah gave a slight shake of his head, silently telling him to go on without him. He had no idea what this was about, but he already didn't like it. As the last student filed out, Miss Thornton sat down at her desk, folding her hands neatly on top of a stack of papers. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something calculating. "Elijah?" she began, her tone lighter than usual, almost conversational. That put him even more on edge. "I overheard you talking the other day," she continued, "about your grandfather." Elijah frowned. "His grandfather? What about him?" he asked carefully. She tilted her head. "You said he was a musician." Elijah's shoulders tensed slightly. He had mentioned it to Tyler earlier that week, just in passing. Had she really been listening? He nodded. "Yeah, he played jazz." Miss Thornton's lips curled. Not quite a smirk, but something close. "Interesting." Elijah said nothing. He knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. She leaned back slightly, tapping her fingers against the desk. "You must have picked up a thing or two." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. There it is. She wasn't just making conversation. She was setting something up. Elijah forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "A little," he admitted. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Good to know." Then she gestured toward the dusty old upright piano in the corner of the room, an instrument so forgotten it blended into the background. "Tomorrow, let's see what you've got." Elijah's stomach dropped. There it is. This wasn't encouragement. This was a challenge, a public one. He met her gaze, searching for any sign that he was misreading the situation, but he wasn't. She expected him to hesitate, to stumble, to fail. And the worst part? She wanted to see it happen. But she didn't know the full story. Elijah lifted his chin slightly. "All right," he said, voice steady. He would play, but it wouldn't go how she expected. Elijah lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping against his stomach. A habit, a rhythm, a silent melody only he could hear. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside his window, casting long, thin shadows across the walls. He should have been asleep, but how could he? Miss Thornton's words played over and over in his mind. "Tomorrow, let's see what you've got." She had said it with a smile, but Elijah had seen the challenge in her eyes. This wasn't about music. This was a test, not a test of skill, not even a test of confidence, a test of worth. She expected him to hesitate, to freeze up in front of the class, proving whatever assumptions she already had about him. Maybe she thought he was all talk. Maybe she assumed that just because his grandfather had talent, it didn't mean Elijah did. Maybe she just wanted him to fail. But what she didn't know? Elijah had been playing piano since he was 5. He could still remember the first time his grandfather had sat him down at the old upright in their living room, his weathered hands guiding Elijah's tiny fingers over the keys. "Music isn't just about hitting the right notes, boy," his grandfather had told him. "It's about telling a story. Feel it. Let it say something." And Elijah had. He had spent years learning, practicing, perfecting, not because anyone forced him to, but because he loved it. Music was the one thing in his life that no one could take away from him. He turned onto his side, exhaling slowly. Miss Thornton thought she had him cornered. She thought she was setting him up for failure, but she had no idea what was coming. The nerves were still there, twisting in his stomach, but beneath them, something stronger was brewing. Determination. He wasn't going to just play. He was going to make sure she never underestimated him again. Tomorrow, Miss Thornton would see him, really see him, for the first time. And this time, she wouldn't be able to look away. The moment Elijah stepped into the classroom, he felt it. The shift. The energy in the room was different today. Whispers floated between students, small smirks exchanged like inside jokes. They all knew. Everyone knew. "Elijah's playing today," someone murmured near the back. He kept his expression neutral, but his pulse quickened. This was exactly what Miss Thornton wanted. She hadn't just challenged him. She had made sure everyone was watching. Tyler caught his eye from his usual seat, raising an eyebrow in silent question. "You good?" Elijah gave a small nod as he slid into his chair. But the moment he set his bag down, Miss Thornton spoke. "All right, let's not waste any time." She turned toward the old upright piano in the corner, the one no one ever touched, its keys likely stiff with dust. She smirked. "Elijah, let's see what you've got." A quiet ripple of anticipation moved through the class. Some students looked amused, others indifferent. A few seemed genuinely curious. Elijah swallowed the knot in his throat and stood. He wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't give them the moment they were expecting, the nervous pause, the shaking hands, the excuse to back out. Keeping his shoulders squared, he stepped forward. The walk to the piano felt longer than it should have. Each step pressed against the weight of expectation, against the invisible force of doubt that Miss Thornton had tried to pin to him. He could feel her eyes on him, not just hers, everyone's. For the first time all year, they weren't ignoring him. They were waiting. Elijah reached the piano and let his fingers drift over the keys, feeling the rough edges where time had worn them down. It was old, slightly out of tune, but it didn't matter. Slowly, he pulled out the bench and sat down. The room fell completely silent. This was it, the moment they expected him to fail. Elijah exhaled, fingers hovering just above the keys. Then, without another second of hesitation, he played. Elijah's fingers hovered over the keys for a fraction of a second. Then he played. The first note rang out, soft but deliberate, cutting through the expectant silence of the room. A slow, rolling melody followed, rich and full despite the slightly out-of-tune piano. It wasn't just sound. It was emotion, woven into every keystroke. And just like that, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The quiet murmurs, the barely contained smirks, they were gone. At first, the students were still, almost confused, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. This wasn't the hesitant, clumsy attempt they had expected. This was something else entirely. Elijah didn't rush. His hands moved with practiced ease, shaping the music the way his grandfather had taught him. Letting it breathe, letting it tell a story. A deep, rolling bass line swelled beneath a soaring melody, each note deliberate, precise, yet effortless. By the time he reached the first transition, a realization had settled over the class. Elijah wasn't just good. He was extraordinary. Across the room, Tyler sat frozen, eyebrows raised in disbelief. Even Brandon, who had been smirking earlier, leaned forward slightly, arms crossed, no trace of mockery left on his face. Elijah didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel it. The shift. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. And then, he made the mistake of glancing at Miss Thornton. Her expression was unreadable, but the smugness was gone. Her arms were still crossed, but her jaw was tight, her fingers drumming against her elbow. She hadn't expected this. Elijah turned his focus back to the piano, his confidence growing with every note. He pushed further, letting the melody swell, letting the rhythm build into something powerful. And the class, the entire class, was silent. No whispers, no side conversations, no distractions. They were listening. Elijah's fingers danced over the keys, shifting seamlessly into a run his grandfather had taught him, one that had taken him months to perfect. It felt right. It felt like he belonged here. And for the first time all year, Miss Thornton wasn't in control of the room. He was. As the last note faded into the stillness, Elijah let his hands rest on his lap, exhaling slowly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the back of the room, a single clap, then another. Then, suddenly, the entire class erupted in applause. Miss Thornton remained silent, but Elijah knew. She had heard him, and she would never overlook him again. The final note hung in the air, stretching into silence. Elijah let his fingers rest lightly on the keys, his heartbeat steady now, not from nerves, but from the sheer energy of what had just happened. For a second, no one moved. The classroom, which had always been filled with idle whispers, shifting chairs, and the scratch of pencils against paper, was now completely still. Then, a single clap. It came from the back of the room, hesitant at first. Then another, and another. Suddenly, the room erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor as students turned to each other, talking all at once. Some clapped, some whistled. A few just sat there, staring, as if they were still processing what they had just heard. Even Tyler, who had never been at a loss for words, looked stunned. "Dude," he breathed, shaking his head. Elijah slowly lifted his hands from the keys, exhaling. He had done more than play. He had changed something. And then, from across the room, Brandon's voice cut through the noise. That's all you're gonna say? The chatter died down, and heads turned in unison toward Miss Thornton. She was still standing by her desk, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was unreadable, but something had changed in her posture. She had lost control of the room. For the first time all year, she wasn't the one commanding attention. Elijah was. She cleared her throat. That was unexpected. A few students exchanged glances. That's it? Brandon scoffed, shaking his head. Unexpected? He gestured toward Elijah. That was insane. And you know it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the class. A girl in the back, Madison, leaned forward, her expression sharp. If it was Brandon up there, you'd be raving about it. More whispers. More students nodding. Miss Thornton's fingers curled slightly against her arm. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to. He had already won. The room wasn't the same anymore. The balance had shifted. Before today, he had been invisible. Now, he was undeniable. Miss Thornton's eyes flickered toward him. Something unreadable flashed across her face, and for the first time, she looked away first. Elijah pushed back the piano bench and stood. The applause hadn't been for Miss Thornton's approval. It had been for him, and for the first time all year, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Seen. The room was still buzzing. The energy, the whispers, the quiet exchange of glances. It was all there. Miss Thornton stood rigid at her desk, her jaw tight, her arms crossed a little too firmly. She wasn't used to this. For a full year, she'd been the unshaken authority in this classroom. What she said was final. What she acknowledged mattered. But now, she was no longer the center of attention. Elijah was, and she hated it. She cleared her throat, tapping a manicured finger against the edge of her desk. All right, settle down. A few students exchanged glances, but no one immediately obeyed. The usual order of things, the way Miss Thornton dictated the flow of the classroom, had fractured. Elijah stood by the piano, his hands resting lightly at his sides. He could feel the heat of every gaze on him, waiting, expecting him to back down. But he didn't. Instead, he met Miss Thornton's gaze, steady, unflinching, unafraid. And then he said it. You didn't think I could do it, did you? The room went still again. The question hung between them like a challenge, settling into the silence Miss Thornton hadn't expected to lose. She blinked, the muscle in her jaw tightening. That's enough, Elijah. It was a command, clipped and sharp. A last attempt to reclaim control. But it was too late. A murmur rippled through the room. They had all heard it. Miss Thornton hadn't answered. Because she couldn't. Because Elijah was right. He hadn't just proven her wrong. He had forced her to confront it. Brandon smirked from his seat, shaking his head. Thought so. Even Madison, who rarely spoke, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. You didn't expect him to be good? A few students nodded. Some just watched Miss Thornton, waiting. Waiting for her to say something real. Waiting for her to admit it. But she wouldn't. Miss Thornton's lips pressed into a thin line. And then, she looked away. Not for long. Just a flicker. A second. But Elijah saw it, and so did the rest of the class. That was all he needed. Elijah exhaled, feeling a weight lift off his chest. He had won something today. Something more than just applause. He turned, walking back to his seat before she could dismiss him. The lesson was over. And for the first time all year, Elijah had been the one to teach it. The next morning, everything felt different. Elijah could sense it the moment he stepped into the school hallway. It wasn't anything obvious. No grand gestures, no confetti falling from the ceiling. But people saw him now. A few heads turned as he walked past. Not in the usual indifferent way, where people glanced through him like he wasn't there, but as if they were actually noticing him for the first time. Elijah! He turned, surprised to see Madison waving him over. Madison, who had barely spoken to him before yesterday. She smirked. That was crazy, by the way. Before he could respond, Brandon appeared beside her, nodding. Dude, I had no idea you could play like that. Elijah shrugged. Not something I really talked about. Brandon chuckled. Yeah, well, you don't have to. Pretty sure the whole school's talking about it now. Elijah wasn't sure how to feel about that, but as more classmates, people who had never acknowledged him before, stopped to say something, to give him a nod, to include him in conversations he'd never been part of, he realized something. He had changed things. Not just for himself, but for the way people saw him. By the time he entered Miss Thornton's classroom, the usual weight of invisibility was gone. He took his seat, and Tyler leaned in with a grin. "You're kind of a big deal now." Elijah rolled his eyes. "It's just one moment." Tyler smirked. "Yeah, well, one moment can change a lot." Miss Thornton entered a minute later, her usual air of authority intact. But as she set her books down, her gaze flickered toward Elijah. She didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge what had happened. But Elijah noticed the way she hesitated, the way she shifted ever so slightly, as if something about him unsettled her now. And when she started the lesson, she did something she had never done before. She called on him. No hesitation. No skipping over him like he wasn't there. "Elijah," she said, without the usual dismissive tone, "what are your thoughts?" For the first time, her voice held something new. Respect. Elijah met her gaze. And then, with quiet confidence, he answered. This wasn't about Miss Thornton's validation. He didn't need her approval. She could never erase what had happened. She could never unsee him again. Because some lessons aren't taught in textbooks. Some are learned the hard way.